Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She sat alone, cloth in hand, oil brushing across steel, polishing every inch of her M107A1 as if it were a living thing. The room smelled of diesel fuel, paper maps, and the faint sting of Afghan dust. Voices filled the air, men laughing, bragging, clapping each other on the back. But her corner was silent. Nobody looked her way. And maybe that was just how she preferred it, or maybe it cut deeper than she'd ever admit. Staff Sergeant Viper, to those who dared call her anything at all, leaned into her work, each stroke of the cleaning rod a prayer of discipline. The wasn't just a weapon. It was trust, survival, memory. It was the one thing that never doubted her. But even trust could be broken if someone was foolish enough to reach for it. The steel case stood against the wall beside her, shadowing her in the cramped plywood briefing shack at Fob Chapman. Outside, the Khost Province mountains were already warming under the Afghan sun. Inside, time ticked slowly toward 800. She didn't raise her eyes when the door opened, not even when boots scuffed loud against the wooden floor. Because she knew, she could feel it, something was about to happen that would make this day different. Her life had been training her for moments like this, but not for the reason most people thought. Was 28, 5'6", lean muscle carved by years of dragging rifles and rucksacks across unforgiving, a body hardened not by vanity but by necessity. Yet no matter the record she broke, no matter the mission she saved, the first glance from new commanders always held the same doubt. The flicker of dismissal. The silent question, what's she doing here? She had learned to live with that question, but not to forgive it. Her grandfather would have told her to ignore them. Never let them see you break. His voice, heavy with Russian grit, echoed in her mind as clearly now as when she was 12 years old, lying in Montana grass with a Remington 700 steady against her shoulder. Victor had fought his own war in Afghanistan back in the 1980s. Soviet fatigues, cold rations, frozen ground. He never spoke about the ambushes he survived or the men he lost, but he spoke about the rifle, about discipline, about patience that outlasts every storm. At 12 years old, she could hit prairie dogs at 500 yards. By 16, her father, a former Marine who had sworn he would never let his daughter follow his path, drove her to a recruiter after she embarrassed his entire reunion unit in a shooting competition. She enlisted at 18. Every test she crushed, every qualification she aced. And yet somehow, it never seemed to be enough. The Army sniper course at Fort Benning nearly broke her. Not her body, she could hump a ruck uphill for 12 miles and still run another 2. It was the silence, the stares, the instructors making her prove herself twice over while the others coasted by. If her calculations weren't perfect, they weren't just wrong. They were ammunition for every whispered doubt, so she made them perfect. She graduated with honors. She set course records. She walked off that parade field with the commander's certificate in her hand and a fire in her chest. But medals and certificates don't silence the doubts. Not in briefing rooms like this. Not in a plywood shack where testosterone leaks from every corner like diesel fumes. The chatter around her dimmed when the door opened again at 7:55. Vice Admiral entered, 3 stars glinting like armor on his collar. 40 years of Navy arrogance shaped into a single man. He walked like the air belonged to him, his entourage trailing in lockstep. Commanders, lieutenants, ribbons across their chests thick enough to stock a craft store. The Admiral didn't look at the Rangers or the SEALs first. He saw her. He saw the rifle case propped against the wall, and his eyes narrowed like a man who just spotted a mistake in his kingdom. He cut through the room, straight toward her, ignoring every other operator. His voice carried across the shack before he even stopped moving. "What's a little girl doing with a big gun like that?" The words hung, heavy, suffocating. Conversation stilled. Boots stopped shifting. Soldiers who had spilled blood together now pretended to study maps on the wall. Master Sergeant Williams from the Rangers cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Sir, Staff Sergeant holds the record for longest confirmed engagement in theater. She's..." waved him off with a flick of his wrist. I've been shooting since Annapolis. Competition circuits. Precision is in my blood. Don't talk to me about records. What this operation needs is real shooters, not diversity quotas filling seats at the table. The words burned hotter than the Afghan sun. Didn't move, didn't blink. Her hand stayed steady on the cloth, tracing one last line along the receiver. Then leaned in. His voice dipped lower, patronizing, sharp as broken glass. "Sweetheart, get your pretty little hands off that rifle. This is a man's weapon." He reached for and in that instant the room froze. Everyone knew the rule. You never touched another sniper's weapon. Not ever, not without permission. Because a rifle was not just steel and optics. It was identity. It was tuned to her breathing, her trigger pull. It was zeroed to her life. To grab it was to spit on everything she had earned. His fingers curled around the barrel. He tugged. And for the first time that morning, lifted her eyes. Her gaze cut through him like glass under a torch. Not anger, not fear, something colder, something deeper. Inside, her grandfather's voice spoke again. "Never let them see you break." But God, she was tired, bone-deep tired, of the questions, of the dismissals, of the endless need to prove what should have been obvious. Iraq hadn't been enough. 3 days in a sandstorm, holding overwatch for a medical convoy, one shot saving lives that never even knew her name. Afghanistan hadn't been enough. 8 enemies dropped in 8 seconds, her position never exposed, the report reduced to fortunate timing. Now here, this man with soft hands and manicured nails dared to question whether she belonged at the table. His ribbons told a story. Bronze Star without a V, service, not combat. Comfortable wars fought from offices with polished desks. Men like him made decisions that got 19-year-olds like Martinez killed. She could still see Martinez's face, still hear the news that he'd taken a bullet from the sniper she had been tracking. She'd been pulled off the hunt by command. Someone else decided she was needed elsewhere. Martinez never came back. And now Admiral's grip tightened. There became a bridge between them, his authority against her existence. The air in the room shifted. Operators sat, weapons on their knees tightened in calloused hands. The temperature felt 10 degrees colder. "Didn't let go." The Admiral tugged harder. And that was when Specialist Murphy burst through the door, breathless, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on his face. His hands clutched fresh intel. 6 high-value targets, a Taliban leadership meeting, 4 hours from now. The kind of opportunity that came once a deployment. The room's energy snapped from ego to mission in an instant. All eyes went to the Admiral, but his hand was still on her rifle. His pride was still locked against her grip. And for the first time that morning, the silence was not about her being ignored. It was about her being the one person the entire task force suddenly needed. But didn't see it, not yet. Instead, he cleared his throat, straightened his jacket with his uninjured hand, and began outlining a plan. He spoke about Overwatch as if it were a formality, as if any trained marksman could handle it. He gestured to a lieutenant, a boy barely 25, whose longest confirmed shot was probably on a qualification range at basic. The SEAL Chief Jackson shifted in his chair, jaw tight. "Sir, with respect, those shots require an experienced sniper. Variable wind, distances over 1,600 meters." "Cut him off. Marksmanship is marksmanship. I'll have my staff officer handle it. I understand precision." His grip didn't falter, not on the rifle, not on herself. But inside, something shifted. She knew what came next would decide everything. And it wasn't going to be about pride. It was going to be about lives. What happens when authority pulls harder than respect? The Admiral's grip tightened. His knuckles whitened as he yanked with more force than before. Felt her body shift off balance, but her training spoke louder than her frustration. In a single fluid motion, instinct overrode hesitation. Her left hand snapped up, clamping his wrist. She rotated with his momentum, her movements controlled, precise, the language of combatives ingrained into muscle memory. His body folded before he realized what had happened. A joint lock pressed down on his median nerve. A searing pain shot through his arm. The crack echoed, not bone, not quite, but close enough. Ligaments screamed. The admiral dropped to one knee, face pale, breath ragged. The room erupted. Security detail hands moved toward holsters. SEALs and Rangers rose from chairs, muscles coiled, the standoff electric. 3 seconds stretched into eternity. 3 seconds where the fate of the mission, her career, maybe even her freedom, teetered on a knife's edge. And then released. No flourish, no triumph, just release. She caught his elbow, steadied him as he staggered back to his feet. Her movements professional, almost detached, as if helping him stand were no different than clearing her weapon. The admiral's face flushed crimson. Pride burned deeper than the strain in his wrist. He opened his mouth to shout, to condemn, to bury her career in military law. But she spoke first. "Give me 6 targets," she said, her voice even, steady, carrying across the room. "Any distance you choose. If I miss one, I'll accept whatever disciplinary action you want. Court-martial, discharge, prison, your call. But if I hit them all, you let me run overwatch. No interference." The challenge cut through the tension like a clean blade. Silence. Soldiers who had fought through mountains and deserts now held their breath. His pride bristled. His career was built on control, on obedience. And here stood a staff sergeant, enlisted, female, offering him a bargain that boxed him in. But he couldn't step back, not in front of this many eyes. Through clenched teeth his voice cracked, "Fine." Word spread like wildfire. Within minutes the dirt range behind the fob was crowded. Operators lined the berms. Some leaned against vehicles, arms crossed. Others crouched low, eyes narrowed, eager to witness what might become legend or humiliation. 6 steel silhouettes were planted at staggering distances, 800 meters, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, 1,600, and one just shy of impossibility, 1,810 meters, the farthest the range could manage, stretching's reach to its edge. The admiral stood to the side, hand bound by a medic's wrap, face tight with pain he wouldn't admit. His pride had brought them all here. Now hers would carry the rest. Didn't rush. She approached the rifle like an old friend, laying it gently on the bipod. She breathed, slow, measured. The world shrank. The laughter, the whispers, the murmurs of bets placed behind her back all dissolved. Wind, mirage, air density. She felt them before she saw them. She watched the dust lift in uneven streams, read the currents between. This was her language. Numbers, rhythms, equations that lived not on paper but in muscle, in breath. She chambered around. The bolt slid home like a heartbeat. First target, 800 meters. Routine. She exhaled, the trigger broke clean. Steel rang, center mass. The crowd muttered, respect beginning to shift. Second, 1,000 meters. A sudden gust twisted dust through the valley. She adjusted, one click, half a breath. The shot cracked. Steel sang again. Third, 1,200. Mirage shimmered. Heat distorted lines. She corrected, aiming where her eyes told her not to. Dead center. Her hands never trembled. But inside something else moved, not doubt, not fear. Memory. Martinez, her father, her grandfather. Every dismissal she had swallowed whole. Every name she had been called that had nothing to do with soldier or sniper or comrade. Fourth, 1,400. Crosswind pressed, stronger now. She dialed correction, fired, impact. The murmurs behind her grew louder. No one shuffled now. No one laughed. Fifth, 1,600. The bullet took over 2 seconds to reach. A lifetime. She felt each heartbeat before steel clanged with finality. Headshot. She closed her eyes for half a breath. One more. The final target stood at 1,810 meters, almost 2 kilometers. A shot most would never attempt outside theory. She slowed everything. She watched the wind trace invisible paths through dust. She let silence fall heavy on her shoulders. Then she squeezed. Time stretched. 3 seconds of flight. The sound of impact rang across the range like a church bell. The crowd erupted. For 30 long seconds the Admiral said nothing. His injured hand wrapped in gauze, his eyes locked on her like a man watching his own authority collapse beneath him. And then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his uninjured left hand. He saluted. The gesture wasn't required, not from an officer to enlisted, but it was everything. The air shifted, pride bent into respect. And when he spoke, the words cracked louder than the rifle had. "Staff Sergeant, you have overwatch." She gave no smile, no nod, just silence, because vindication doesn't shout, it breathes. That night, as the task force geared for the mission, she found herself in a rare pocket of solitude, cleaning the again, sliding each round into place. The whispers had changed from doubt to awe, but awe carried its own weight. Now they expected perfection. And in the stillness, she asked herself the question that always came before a mission, the one that had no answer. How many shots would she take tonight that would save lives, and how many would haunt her in silence? The convoy rolled before dawn, engines low, the air sharp with anticipation, settled into her overwatch nest on a jagged outcrop above the valley. Through her scope, the world narrowed. 6 high-value targets below, their silhouettes shadowed by bodyguards, rifles slung, arrogance in their stride. Her breath slowed, her finger rested light on the trigger. And yet she hesitated, not because she couldn't take the shot, but because, for just a heartbeat, she remembered something she hadn't told anyone. Not yet. Something that could change everything about this mission. What does it feel like to hold 6 lives in your crosshairs? The valley lay hushed beneath her scope, shadows long and jagged against the rising sun. From this ridge, the earth looked fragile, carved by centuries of wind and blood. Lay prone, balanced, heartbeat sinking with the slow creep of dawn. Below, the convoy of Taliban leaders shuffled into place. 6 high-value targets, layers of guards, radios crackled in their hands, weapons slung with casual arrogance. They thought this valley was theirs. They didn't know she was here. Through the glass, every detail sharpened. The wrinkle of a man's scarf, the shine of an oil-stained rifle sling, the dust stirred by boots on gravel. Her finger hovered, not tense, not loose, waiting. But inside she wasn't calm, not fully. Because there was something she hadn't told them. Not the Admiral, not the Rangers, not the SEALs watching her from below, trusting her eyes. She had kept it buried, silent, hidden like a wound beneath armor. Her grandfather's words echoed again, "Never let them see you break." But silence doesn't heal, it festers. Steadied her breath, forcing the thought away as the first target emerged into clear view. Commander, thick beard, sunglasses catching the light. A man who had ordered attacks that left American boys and girls in body bags. She thought of Martinez, 19, too young to have a headstone. Her scope rose, settled. The wind tugged at the dust. She adjusted 3 clicks left. The trigger broke. Steel and flesh met. The body crumpled. Chaos erupted below. Voices shouted. Guards scrambled. But was already on the second target. 1,200 meters. Narrow window between 2 stone walls. He ducked, thought he was safe. She timed the pause between his steps, the moment his head turned back. She fired. The wall cracked, he dropped. The valley was fire now. Men running, yelling, spraying bullets into shadows. They didn't know where death came from, only that it was watching. His jaw clenched as she shifted to the third. 1,400 meters. Crosswind biting hard. She adjusted, fired. Another fell. Her radio crackled, Chief Jackson's voice low. "Viper, you're clear. Keep them blind. We're moving." She didn't answer. Words took too much, her rifle spoke enough. Fourth, fifth, guards toppled, the valley's panic grew. The targets scrambled toward vehicles, desperate to escape. Then she saw him. The sixth, taller than the others, scar across his cheek. Intelligence called him the Spider, the one who wove networks across provinces, who placed bombs on roads soldiers drove every day. Her scope found him climbing into a truck. Her finger tightened and froze, because in that instant she saw what the others didn't. A child, small, no more than 7 or 8, clinging to the back of his tunic, eyes wide, terrified. The shot was hers. She could take it, clean, precise. A single trigger pulled to end months of bloodshed. But what about the child? Her breath faltered, sweat prickled at her brow. No one else saw it. To the operators below, this was just another silhouette, another kill. To the admiral listening on comms, this was proof she belonged here. But to her, it was something more, something that reached deeper than training, deeper than pride. She thought of herself at 8 years old, lying in Montana grass, her grandfather's steady hand guiding her breath, teaching her patience, discipline. A child not yet touched by war. Could she really pull the trigger and risk turning another child into a memory? Her finger trembled for the first time in years. "Viper, do you have him?" Jackson's voice cut sharp through the radio. She didn't answer. Her heartbeat thundered. She adjusted her scope. The child shifted, just an inch, but enough. She whispered to herself, so soft it was almost prayer, "Not today." Her shot snapped off, not at the Spider's chest, but at the truck's tire. The steel rim burst, shattering under the force. The vehicle jolted sideways. The Spider stumbled, yanking the child away. Before he could rise again, fired a second time. The round tore through his shoulder, spinning him to the dirt, alive but pinned. The SEAL team surged in, closing distance fast, rifles up. The child was dragged clear by locals, running into the hills. The mission shifted from kill to capture. Within minutes, 6 leaders were in custody. Victory, but didn't feel it. She lay back from the scope, breath shuddering, heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years: doubt. Would they call her hesitation weakness? Would they say she flinched, that she risked the mission for sentiment? Or would they never know the truth, that a child's eyes had stopped her cold, and that mercy had changed the course of the mission? The extraction was chaos. Radios crackled with confirmation, cheers, relief, the kind of relief that comes when every man in the unit walks back alive. But she felt none of it. In the debrief's voice carried through the room, steadier now, humbled. He spoke of precision, of flawless overwatch, of how her fire had blinded the enemy long enough to seize every target alive. He praised her without hesitation. He even used the word indispensable. And everyone applauded. Everyone but her. Because applause felt hollow when the image of a child's terrified eyes refused to leave. That night, alone in her cot, she sat with the across her knees, the rifle that had never betrayed her, the rifle that demanded decisions no human heart could make clean. Her hand shook, just once, just enough. And she whispered words no one else would hear. "I almost didn't pull the trigger." Silence answered. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Because the truth was heavier than the rifle in her lap. And she knew this wasn't the last time she'd face it. Why did applause feel heavier than silence? The debriefing room buzzed with triumph. Maps scattered across the table, radios still hot from chatter, dust and sweat clinging to uniforms. Every operator who had walked into the valley that morning now sat alive, breathing, hearts still pounding from adrenaline but safe. That in itself was a victory worth more than medals. Vice Admiral stood at the head of the room, his bandaged hand tucked neatly against his side. He spoke with the authority of a man who knew every eye was on him, but his tone had shifted. No arrogance, no dismissive sneer. Instead, his voice carried weight, respect, even humility. "Without Overwatch," he said, letting the words hang, "this mission would have failed. Without Staff Sergeant, none of you would be sitting here with 6 high-value targets in custody." The room erupted in claps, boots pounding lightly against the floor, men nodding toward her corner. Sat still, hands folded, eyes lowered. She didn't smile. Applause had never brought Martinez back. Applause had never silenced the whispers at Fort Benning, or filled the void left when her grandfather's old stories went quiet. Applause couldn't erase the face of the child she had seen in her scope. Still, she lifted her chin and nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement, nothing more. The Admiral's gaze lingered on her. For a moment, his expression softened almost like regret, almost like apology. Then he turned back to the others, dismissing them with orders to rest, reset, prepare for follow-on ops. As the room emptied, approached her table, his steps were measured, deliberate. She braced. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, "a word." The others filed out, leaving them in the heavy silence of maps and dust. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I let my pride blind me to your skill. That won't happen again." Her eyes searched his face. Was this sincerity or politics? A man saving face after being humbled in front of warriors. "You're not the first," she answered softly. "And probably not the last." He allowed himself the faintest smile, then sobered. "But you've given me something I can't ignore. Proof. Proof that ability matters more than assumption. That precision saves lives." The words weren't empty. They struck deeper than she wanted them to, because they echoed what she had always believed, what her grandfather had drilled into her bones. Every shot means another soldier goes home. She nodded once, then let the rifle speak for itself. He studied her a moment longer, then extended his good hand. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." She shook it, firm, professional, no warmth. And that was enough. 3 days later, formal recognition came down. A Silver Star recommendation. Not for the range demonstration. Not for humiliating an admiral. But for overwatch during the mission, for eliminating threats, ensuring capture without friendly losses, preventing planned attacks that would have spilled more blood. The paperwork described her as calm, precise, indispensable. But the words that mattered most to her weren't written. They lived only in memory, in the quiet seconds between shots, the choice not to kill the spider with a child clinging to him, the decision to aim for capture instead of execution. No one knew, no one ever would. And maybe that was the point. Recognition came with shadows. The SEALs and Rangers who once looked past her now nodded respectfully in the mess tent. Some even sought her advice, asked about wind calls, scope settings, breathing techniques. She shared what she knew, never with arrogance, always with patience. But every nod of respect pressed heavier than the doubt had, because now they expected perfection, and perfection wasn't human. Late at night, she lay awake in her cot, staring at the thin canvas ceiling beside her like a sentinel. She replayed the moment in her mind, the crosshairs, the child, the choice. Her grandfather's voice rose again, patience, precision, discipline. But this time it was joined by another, Martinez's laugh, faint, fatting. She whispered into the silence, "Did I do the right thing?" The silence offered no answer. Weeks passed, missions continued, each one blurred into the next, dust, heat, the hum of engines, the crack of rifle fire, but something had shifted inside her. Return to Norfolk. Rumor spread that he'd pushed for policy changes, evaluations based on merit, not assumption. Some said he had written directly to command about her. Others whispered he was making amends. She didn't dwell on it. Change, if it came, would come slowly, too late for those already buried. But she noticed something else. Her hands. They had begun to shake, not in combat, never in the scope, but in the quiet. When the rifle was cleaned and stored, when the mission was done, when the silence pressed too close. She hit it well, no one saw. Except herself. The day the silver star was pinned on her chest, cameras clicked, commanders smiled, speeches were made about courage and precision. She stood at attention, face blank, eyes forward. She accepted the medal with the same stillness she held in the scope. But inside she felt nothing. Afterward she walked alone to her quarters. She placed the medal in her footlocker beside her grandfather's old Soviet badge, the medal cold against the wood. Then she sat on her cot, laid across her knees, and let the silence swallow her whole. The rifle didn't ask for applause. It didn't care for medals. It demanded only one thing: that she never break. And yet, as she stared at her shaking hands, she wondered, how much longer could she hold? Why is it harder to live in silence than to fight in chaos? The orders came sealed, stamped, and official. Fort, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, SOTIC, Instructor Billet. Read them twice, as if the words might change on the second pass. Instructor. She had spent 10 years proving she belonged behind a rifle. Now they wanted her behind a podium. The barracks had felt sterile after Afghanistan. Clean walls, fluorescent lights, perfectly cut lawns outside. No dust, no diesel, no mountains pressing close against the sky. She unpacked her gear slowly, methodically. In the locker, uniforms folded. Silver star at the bottom of the drawer, hidden under spare socks. The first morning she stood at the range as students gathered, she felt out of place. These men, some younger than she'd been when she enlisted, some seasoned operators with scars across their faces, stared at her with the same flicker she knew too well: doubt. But the rifle on the table silenced it. She laid out the fundamentals with a surgeon's clarity: wind, distance, breathing, mirage. Her voice carried not the tone of someone who'd read manuals, but of someone who had lived each principle when failure meant death. The students listened, some grudgingly, some hungrily. By the second week, the whispers changed. They spoke of her record, her shot at 1,987 meters, her name that floated through after-action reports like myth. But myth didn't silence her nights. Because when the students went back to barracks, when the ranges emptied, she walked alone across the grass, the weight of her rifle absent from her shoulder. She'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes that fort couldn't erase: the crack of a shot, the ringing steel, the silence after a life ended. And sometimes she saw the child again. She tried to bury it in discipline. She arrived earlier than her peers. She stayed later. She cleaned rifles no one else touched, as if the routine could scrub ghosts out of steel. But ghosts don't live in rifles. They live in memory. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the Carolina pines, she stayed behind after the range closed. Alone, she set up a target at 1,000 meters. Not regulation, not necessary, just her. She lay prone, steady, scope aligned. She breathed. The trigger broke, steel rang, perfect. But she didn't feel it. The shot echoed into emptiness, no mission to anchor it, no lives tethered to its success. Just noise. Her chest tightened, her hands shook again. "Staff Sergeant," a voice broke the silence. She flinched, rolling to her elbow. At the edge of the berm stood Master Sergeant, another instructor, weathered face, eyes sharp but kind. "You always stay this late?" he asked, stepping closer. "Just keeping sharp," she replied. Studied her for a long moment. "Sharp's not the problem, Viper. You're the best shot I've ever seen, but you look like you're fighting something you can't shoot at." The words cut deeper than she wanted them to. She turned back to the scope, avoiding his eyes. "I'm fine," she lied. He didn't press, just nodded, stepping away. "Don't let the ghosts win," he said softly before leaving. The phrase followed her for weeks. She trained students with precision, molding them into marksmen who understood that every bullet carried weight. She drilled into them what her grandfather drilled into her: patience, discipline, respect for the rifle. Some she saw rise, some she saw stumble. and each stumble reminded her of Martinez, reminded her that one mistake, one misjudgment could mean death. The more she taught, the more she realized something she had never admitted. She wasn't just passing on skills, she was passing on pieces of herself. Every story, every correction, every whispered reminder to breathe. She was giving them the parts of her she could no longer carry alone. But giving doesn't empty the burden. At night, she still woke drenched in sweat, heart racing from dreams where the child's face appeared in her scope. Sometimes she fired. Sometimes she froze. Either way, she woke with the same hollow ache. The silver star sat untouched in her drawer. She never wore it, not because she didn't respect what it meant, but because medals weighed heavier than rifles when you knew the cost. Letters came from her father, short, practical. He wrote about Montana, about the ranch, about hunting season. He never asked about Afghanistan. He never asked about. But once, at the bottom of a page, he scrawled a single line that nearly broke her. "I'm proud of you, even if you don't feel it." She folded that letter and kept it in her pocket. One cold November morning, standing before a new class of wide-eyed candidates, she asked a question she'd never asked before. "Why do you want to be here?" The answers varied: to serve, to protect, to be the best. One young soldier, barely 20, said something different: "Because I don't want to see my friends die." The honesty cut through her like glass. She looked at him longer than she meant to. "Then remember this," she said quietly. "Every shot you take is a weight you'll carry. Don't pull the trigger unless you're willing to live with it. Not just today, not just this mission, for the rest of your life." The range fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just teaching them how to shoot. She was teaching them how to survive themselves. That night, alone in her quarters, she opened her grandfather's old Soviet medal. She laid it beside the silver star. Two pieces of metal, worlds apart but bound by the same truth. Neither could measure dignity. Neither could ease the silence. She sat for hours, hands steady now, staring at the medals, the rifle, the empty room. And she asked herself a question she had avoided for too long. If she wasn't behind the scope anymore, who was she? Why do ghosts grow louder when the living fall silent? The phone call came on a gray morning, the kind where mist clung to the trees around Fort and the air smelled of rain. Had just finished a dawn run, sweat cooling against her skin when the message reached her. Her grandfather, Victor, had passed. She sat on the edge of her bunk, the words heavy in her ears. 92 years old. A man who had survived war, exile, and silence, gone quietly in his sleep. His body had given out, but to her, he had always felt unbreakable. The funeral was small. Montana skis stretched wide above the cemetery, clouds drifting like the ghosts of old campaigns. Veterans from towns across the state came in faded uniforms, medals tarnished with age. They stood straight as the casket lowered, saluting a man who had once been their enemy and later their neighbor. On the nightstand beside his bed, they found two things: his Soviet medals, ribbons frayed with time, and her silver star, printed citation folded carefully beside them. Stood at the graveside longer than anyone else. Wind tugged at her uniform, pine trees whispering. She laid her hand on the cold wood. "I made the shot," she whispered, "but I didn't take it." Her throat tightened, the words cracked like glass. She remembered being 12, the Remington steady in her hands, his rough voice guiding her. Patience, discipline, precision. He had taught her that the rifle was a truth-teller, but he never told her what to do when truth and mercy collided. For the first time since Afghanistan, her eyes burned. Tears slid silently down her cheek. "Was I weak," she asked him, "or was I right?" No answer came from the earth, only the sound of wind through pine. She left Montana with a hollow ache in her chest, the kind that medals couldn't fill. Back at Fort, she threw herself into teaching with even sharper intensity. She drilled students until they cursed her name, then thanked her months later when their shots landed true in the field. She told them less about technique and more about patience, about weight, about how the hardest part of being a sniper wasn't pulling the trigger, but living with what came after. Some listened, some didn't. She saw it in their eyes, the ones who believed war was glory and the ones who already knew it was grief. At night, she kept the Soviet medal and silver star side by side on her desk. She didn't know why. Maybe because between them, they told her entire story. A girl taught by a man who once fought against her nation, now honored by the very nation he had once opposed. Legacy was complicated. One evening, after dismissing a class, she lingered at the range. A storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of rain, the distant rumble of thunder. She lay prone against her shoulder and aimed at a steel silhouette 1,500 meters out. The wind howled, rain beginning to pelt her back. She adjusted, fired. Steel rang faint through the storm. But instead of pride, she felt only emptiness. The ghosts pressed closer. Martinez, the spider, the child, her grandfather. Her hands clenched on the rifle. She pressed her forehead to the scope, rain sliding down her face like tears. "Why do you keep coming back?" she whispered. "Why won't you let me breathe?" She didn't notice Master Sergeant until he was beside her, rain dripping from his cap. He crouched, studying her face, then the rifle. "You can't outshoot ghosts, Viper," he said quietly. Her jaw tightened. "I don't need saving." "I didn't say you did." He paused, eyes on the horizon. "But I know what it looks like when someone's carrying more than their pack. I've been there." She stayed silent. He set his hand lightly on the barrel, not to take it, but to ground it. "You don't have to prove it anymore. Not to me. Not to anyone here. The only one you're still fighting is yourself." The words stung, because they were true. That night in her quarters, she opened her grandfather's old field journal. She had never read it fully before. The Russian script curved across yellowed pages, his handwriting firm despite the years. She traced the lines with her finger, translating slowly. One passage stopped her cold. "We carried rifles, but we carried silence more. No one asks the sniper how many he has taken. No one asks if he remembers their faces. But we do, everyone. Precision saves lives, yes, but it also steals pieces of your soul. The trick is not to lose all of it." Her breath caught. She closed her eyes. He had known. He had always known. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit what she had feared. She was losing pieces of herself, piece by piece, mission by mission, shot by shot. And yet buried in his words was something else, a lifeline. The trick is not to lose all of it. She stared at the silver star, at the Soviet medal, at the journal. Her legacy wasn't just marksmanship, it was survival, not just of body but of soul. She realized then that the choice she had made in Afghanistan, not to kill the spider with a child in his arms, wasn't weakness. It was the sliver of herself she had kept, the piece of soul her grandfather had warned her to protect. The next morning, she stood before her students with steadier hands. She told them the truth she had never spoken aloud in a class. "You'll all fire shots you'll remember for the rest of your life," she said. "But the hardest thing you'll ever face is not the enemy in your scope. It's yourself. And sometimes, survival means keeping a piece of yourself alive, no matter what anyone else thinks." The range was silent, eyes locked on her. For the first time, she felt the ghost step back. Not gone, never gone, but quieter. Because maybe she had finally begun to answer the question that haunted her. Not was I weak, but how do I stay whole? What does redemption sound like? For it wasn't applause. It wasn't medals. It wasn't the quiet salute of an admiral forced into humility. It was the silence of a rifle range at dawn, when the world was still half asleep, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of her breath against steel. Months passed at fort. The students came and went, some cocky, some cautious. She shaped them one by one, carving away arrogance, planting seeds of patience. They learned that wind wasn't an obstacle but a language, that mirage wasn't deception but a signal, that a sniper's heart had to beat slower than fear. They also learned something else, though she never wrote it on a board, never put it in a lesson plan, that the real test wasn't the shot, it was the wait afterward. The more she spoke those truths aloud, the more she realized they weren't just for them. They were for her. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ghosts loosened their grip. Not gone, never gone, but quieter. Until one night they roared back. It was near midnight when the call came. Not combat, not war, training accident. One of her students, the young soldier who had told her he wanted to learn so his friends wouldn't die, was gone. A live fire drill, a misstep, a ricochet. Instant. Pointless. The barracks reeled with grief. The commanders wrote reports, cited safety protocols, promised reviews, but none of it filled the empty bunk at the end of the row. Stood in the dark range the next evening across her knees. She hadn't felt this hollow since Martinez, since Afghanistan. Her mind whispered the cruel question, what's the point? She had taught him everything she could. She had poured her lessons into him like water into desert soil, and still he was gone. Wasn't that proof the ghosts always won? She pressed her hands against her face, fighting the tremor, the heat behind her eyes. She almost didn't hear the footsteps behind her. Again, the quiet watchman who seemed to know when silence was about to swallow her whole. He didn't speak at first, just sat beside her on the cold concrete, staring into the darkness of the range. Finally he said, "You think it's your fault." Her throat tightened, "Isn't it?" "No," he answered, firm, certain. "You gave him everything you had. You can't carry his choices or his fate. That's not yours to own." She shook her head. "Then why does it feel the same, like Martinez, like every name I've buried?" "Because you care." His voice softened. "Because you haven't lost the part of you that still feels. That's not weakness. That's the only proof you're still human." The words broke something inside her, not in pain but in release. For the first time in years, she didn't fight the tears. She let them fall, hot and unrelenting, sliding down her face in the dark. Didn't move, didn't comfort, didn't intrude. He just sat beside her, letting the silence be what it was. And when the storm passed, she breathed deep, shaky but real. She wiped her face, lifted the rifle and looked at him. "Then what do I do with it, all of it?" He met her eyes. "You carry it, not like a burden, like a compass. Let it point you to who you're supposed to be. That's all any of us can do." The words sank into her like stone into still water, ripples spreading, not gone, not fixed, but shifted. In the weeks that followed, she changed how she taught. Less focus on perfection, more on resilience. She told her students that mistakes would come, that ghosts would follow, but that the measure of a sniper wasn't flawless shots, it was the courage to keep breathing afterward. One student asked, "How do you know when you've done enough?" She paused, thinking of her grandfather, of Martinez, of the spider, of the child. Then she said quietly, "You don't. You just make sure you don't lose yourself in the process." The class wrote it down like scripture, but to her it was confession. Spring turned to summer. Orders shifted again. This time not to another war zone, but to a lecture at West Point. A single afternoon, speaking to cadets about precision, about discipline, about what it meant to trust someone who would never stand in formation with them but would watch from shadows, unseen. Standing on that stage, uniform crisp, displayed beside her like an old comrade, she looked out at the sea of young faces. Eager, unscarred, ready for wars they didn't yet understand. She told them about wind, distance, patience. But she also told them about silence, about what it cost, about why dignity didn't come from medals or applause, but from the quiet decisions no one else would ever see. Some looked confused, some leaned forward, hungry to understand, but all of them listened. And when the lecture ended, the hall echoed with applause. This time she let herself feel it, not as validation, not as absolution, but as proof that maybe, just maybe, her ghosts had a purpose beyond haunting her. That night, alone in her quarters, she opened her grandfather's journal again. The passage she had underlined weeks ago stared back at her. The trick is not to lose all of it. She closed the book, set it aside, and looked at her hands. They were steady, for the first time in months. She whispered into the quiet, "I'm still here." And for once, the silence didn't answer with ghosts. It answered with peace. What remains when the war is over, but the silence stays? Asked herself that question more often than she ever admitted. Not in briefings, not in classrooms, not in the polished reports that called her indispensable. Only in the still hours when the rifle was cleaned and locked away, and she was left alone with the echoes of everything it had done. At Fort, life continued. Students came and went. She taught them with the same precision she demanded of herself, but with something more now: patience for their flaws, compassion for their fears. She realized that perhaps her greatest shots weren't measured in meters, but in lives she prepared to return home whole. But the ghosts never vanished completely. They lingered in the edges of dreams, in the quiet moments before dawn, in the softest tremor of her hands when no one was looking. And maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Because ghosts weren't just burdens, they were reminders. The silver star sat where she'd left it, tucked in the drawer, hidden, unpolished. The Soviet medal beside it, tarnished with years. Some nights she'd set them both out on the desk, side by side, and stare at them as if they might argue. Two legacies staring back at her, both claiming a piece of who she was. One spoke of precision, the other of survival. She was somewhere in between. Her father visited once, unannounced. Montana still clung to him, the smell of earth, the roughness of hands that never stopped working. He didn't say much when he arrived. Didn't need to. They sat on the porch of the instructor barracks, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. Finally he looked at her. "You found your place." She thought about it. About the valley in Afghanistan. About Martinez. About the boy who died in training. About the child in her scope. About the cadets at West Point leaning forward, hanging on words she never thought she'd speak aloud. "I found a balance," she said softly. Her father nodded. For him, that was enough. The seasons shifted again. Orders changed. She was given the option to rotate back into combat, to rejoin the operational tempo she had once lived by. She turned it down, not because she was afraid, but because she finally understood that her fight wasn't there anymore. Her fight was here, passing on what she had learned, making sure others didn't lose themselves the way she almost had. One afternoon, walking the range after dismissing her last class of the cycle, she paused at the far berm. Targets riddled with holes leaned against the dirt. Spent casings glittered in the sun like fragments of memory. She crouched, scooped a single shell casing and held it between her fingers. Cold brass, heavy in ways it shouldn't have been. She whispered, "Every one of you stays with me." And then she set it down gently in the dirt. A choice, to let it rest there instead of carrying it another mile. In that moment she felt something lift. Not all of it, never all, but enough. Her grandfather had been right. The trick was not to lose all of it. Years later, her name would be etched into the walls of classrooms, whispered in ranges, remembered in lessons about patience, precision, and restraint. Students who never met her would repeat the stories: the admiral who doubted her, the 6 targets she shattered, the mission that saved them all. Some stories would be exaggerated, some softened, but the truth at the core would remain: she never broke. And maybe that was the only legacy she ever wanted. Because medals tarnish, records fade, names get buried in files. But dignity endures. Not in speeches, not in parades, not even in the stories passed between soldiers on long nights in distant outposts. Dignity endures in silence. In the quiet moment when a sniper steadies their breath, Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the lives that depend on it. In the decision to carry ghosts without letting them consume the last piece of your soul. In the choice to act when others doubt you, not to prove them wrong, but to protect the ones who'll never know your name. Never needed applause. She never needed vindication.